I don't think there's any specific nutrient in plant foods that you can't obtain from animal foods. So I think it is possible for an animal-based diet to be nutritionally complete. I tell my patients that, you know, they want to eat some broccoli or some avocado or something like that. They do it for enjoyment, they do it for pleasure, but not because they think that they're getting some missing nutrition that they otherwise wouldn't be getting in their diets.
Yeah. Are they eating nose to tail? What is your view on, you know, getting the full nutrient spectrum with animal foods?
No, I think we've certainly got enough anecdotal evidence that you don't need to eat nose to tail to be healthy. I think there are certain benefits. So if we have a look at something like a histamine intolerance, which you actually can have on a carnivore style diet. So people will be having aged meat, or they might be having preserved meats like prosciutto or something like that. Or they might even be on a carnivore style diet where they're consuming dairy. They might have fermented dairy like yogurt. Or they might be having deep water fish like sardines and mackerel, which is very high in histamines. We know that there's a substance called DAO, which is found in offal, that can actually help basically deal with the histamine problem. And this is, you know, found in kidneys and in the liver and things like that. So there are specific advantages to nose to tail eating. But again, I think it's population dependent, and I don't need to tell everybody who's on an animal-based diet who comes in. I don't say you must have liver, you must have kidney, you must have brain. It depends on their particular circumstance.
I think that's interesting. So what about fiber? I know you've done some work on fiber and dispelled a lot of the myths around there, which I agree with. I don't think fiber is necessary. I think it's this whole story we've been told based on some anecdotal stuff. So maybe you can go into fiber.
Well, I mean, this is one of the biggest dietary myths that's been out there for a long, long time. The fact that fiber is actually good for treating or preventing constipation, when in actual fact, the exact opposite is true. So when we think about what constipation is, what it boils down to, it's a problem passing something through a small hole. And now we wax lyrical about the capacity of fiber to bulk the stool, you know, would lead anybody to ask, well, how is making something bigger going to make it easier to pass through a small hole? And now when looking for the evidence, there's a lot of evidence or research that's been done on the effect of fiber on the stools. And it definitely shows that it can make the stool bigger. It bulks it out. There is no evidence that it can increase stool moisture. That is a myth, and that has been studied. There is evidence that it can increase transit time, which is basically how quickly things transit through the intestines, then doesn't lead to any increased ease of evacuation. It doesn't make it easier to pass the bowel action. So when we actually worry about symptoms of constipation, so patients come to me complaining of bloating, bleeding, pain. These are symptoms of constipation. People don't come and say, oh, look, I'm worried about my transit time. It's just a wee bit slow. Do you think you could just speed that up 24 hours or so? That's just nothing. People don't ask for that. They don't come in and ask, oh, I need to have a bigger poo. I don't have enough bulk, because that's not important. They worry about being in pain, having their sleep disturbed because their tummy's, you know, upset overnight. And when we look at these kind of things, a zero fiber diet wins hands down. There was one study of 63 participants with idiopathic constipation, and they compared them with different levels of fiber in their diet. And what they actually found, that in the arm that had zero fiber diet, there was 41 of them in that arm, they had 100% resolution of all their symptoms of constipation. And this is still the only experimental design study that I've been able to identify looking at the symptoms of constipation, those things that people absolutely care about. So this notion that we actually need this indigestible substance in our diet for health is just fanciful.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's really about what you're used to, too. I think the problem is some people, they make a dietary change and your body's not used to it, and then they think that that's the end-all be-all. right? It's like if you're eating tons of fiber and then all of a sudden you have a no fiber meal and then maybe you're a little constipated, you think that, oh my God, I need fiber, right? But it's like once people get used to it, we know thousands and thousands of carnivores that have zero fiber and they're having regular bowel movements, right? It's just maybe your body needs to get used to it a little bit.
Well, there's other factors that can affect bowel movements as well. So we know that dairy, and we see this all the time, dairy tends to be very constipating for some people. We know that it can actually be metabolized. Some of the protein can be metabolized into an opiate-like substance, and we know what opiates do to the gastrointestinal tract. They slow it right down. We know that you can have the opposite. We just mentioned histamines a moment ago. So histamines will cause diarrhea. So if you go onto a carnivore-style diet and you're having a lot of sardines, mackerel, or aged meats or things like that, that will certainly affect your gut function. So it's more than just fiber, which has the capacity to upset the gastrointestinal tract.
Right, old school paradigm, he's kind of an older man, he's got to have a well-balanced diet, you know? Meat's great, but you got to have your fiber. And he was saying it's like the mucosal wall, you know, if you don't have the fiber, you're not going to feed the bacteria in the mucosal wall of your intestines. So what do you say to that?
Okay, so the way fiber works in terms of that is that because you can't digest it, it's basically a waste product as far as you're concerned, but your bacteria can. Your bacteria can ferment it. And I will actually also point out that another term for ferment could be rot. These are vegan groups who claim that meat rots in the gut. It's actually the opposite is true. The meat is incredibly well absorbed, and it's actually the fiber which is essentially rotting off.
Yeah, it's the vegetables. Yeah, it's the vegetables that rot and ferment.
So when the bacteria will actually ferment the fiber, they can produce something called a short-chain fatty acid. And this short-chain fatty acid can then be taken up by the cells lining the colon or the intestine, and they can actually use that for energy. But there's two key points here. So the first point is that this production of short-chain fatty acids is restricted to a very, very small part of the colon. So that means only very few cells of the colon can actually be benefited by this, which means that if you have an issue, say with Crohn's disease, which can affect any part of the gastrointestinal tract from the mouth all the way to the anus, then this localized production of short-chain fatty acids is not going to do you diddly squat. Number two, once these colonocytes or these cells actually take up the short-chain fatty acids, they actually then convert them through ketones, which are then used to provide the cell with energy and allow it to produce more mucus and make a healthier barrier. So if the ketone is actually the important thing here, I would argue that it's much more important to be in nutritional ketosis, basically having circulating ketones being delivered to every single cell in your colon, rather than just this patchy uptake from short-chain fatty acid production. So when we actually have a look at the evidence in totality, a state of nutritional ketosis is going to be far better than what little patchwork effect you can get from ingesting fiber.
You're fasting for a few days, you know, not all the time, but maybe you do it a couple times a year. You're getting no fiber. You're not getting any of this mucosal lining, supposed, you know, superfood stuff, yet you're fine and you're healthy. And that's probably because of ketones, right?
Absolutely. I mean, ketones are a wonderful source of energy. I mean, our brains can use ketones very, very effectively. This whole notion that you need fiber, short-chain fatty acids, or an obligatory intake of carbohydrate is just absolute fanciful.
Yeah. So this is interesting. This kind of leads into the microbiome. I know you talk a lot about that as well. So tell us what's going on there.
I mean, the concept of the microbiome is the bacteria in our intestines, in our colon, that basically can be fed by the foodstuffs that we eat. And there's thousands of different varieties of bacteria, and what we eat will actually preferentially feed some of these bacteria and actually lead to a wholesale change in the population. And this is a key point to understand, because if we change our diet, we can literally get a wholesale change in our microbiome within a 24-hour period. And there's a lot of people out there that are thinking that our microbiome will actually control our health, and that if we can change our microbiome, that will then flow on and lead to good health effects. But what they're not understanding is that the microbiome is actually just coming along for the ride. It's what we call a surrogate marker, simply a reflection of the particular diet that we're eating, and it's actually the diet that we're eating that is conferring most of the health benefits. For instance, we know that there's these two main phyla of bacteria. So you've got the Firmicutes and the Bacteroidetes. And the Firmicutes has actually been associated with obesity and metabolic ill health, and the Bacteroidetes has been associated with good health. And interestingly, when we look at people who have been on ketogenic diets to manage their epilepsy, for instance, we find that they have this Bacteroidetes predominance in their microbiome. And that's just simply a reflection of the fact that they've been on a ketogenic style diet. So I really think that these people who are arguing that we need to have probiotics and so on and so forth to improve our health, there's really very, very little evidence for that. So if you take a probiotic, for instance, that is, purported to have, certain benefits, if you don't feed it, as in if you don't eat foods that particular class of bacteria likes to ferment, then it will simply be outcompeted and it won't stay in the gastrointestinal tract for very long. And that's why the best evidence we have for probiotics being beneficial is in conditions like preventing traveller's diarrhea, where people continually take high doses for a period of time. And what can happen then is that the continual replenishment of certain bacteria can outcompete the pathogenic bacteria. So they've done some studies in India, for instance, with a condition called necrotizing enterocolitis in infants. And they found out that if they just gave probiotics, they were not beneficial at all. So then they coined the term called a symbiotic, and they would give a probiotic with a food source that would be particular to those bacteria. And when they gave infants this symbiotic, then they found it was actually quite protective. So it really comes down to the food source. And there's a classical example of this with a condition called pseudomembranous colitis, which is caused by a pathogen called Clostridium difficile. And this has been a problem ever since the early 2000s. We have been having increasing numbers of cases of pseudomembranous colitis, which can actually cause massive bowel inflammation, and it actually is often fatal. So this is a pretty serious condition. And the interesting thing is that this bug in particular has an affinity for something called trehalose, which is basically a manufactured sugar. It's a sugar that can lower the freezing point of foods, which means it's often used in frozen dairy, things like ice cream. And about the year 2000, Japanese scientists figured out a way that they could manufacture it on an industrial scale. And then it gradually became introduced into the food supply around the world. And we can correlate the introduction of trehalose into the food supply with the beginning of these Clostridium difficile epidemics. And this is not junk science. This has actually been well published in Nature, and it's got very, very good evidence for it. So this is a classical case that our microbiome simply reflects what we ourselves eat.
Yeah, I agree with this kind of idea that it's about your diet, and that a healthy microbiome is just a healthy diet, right? It's not that we need some magical, mystical, perfect microbiome that, someone has because they're healthy. It's they're healthy and then they have a good microbiome.
Yeah, and the thing is, who is the arbiter of what a good microbiome is? This goes back to our discussion right at the very start about, what metrics we use to assess health. And we'll often see comments along the lines of, a whole grain diet increases microbial diversity or something like that. And it may do. But the question is, who is the arbiter that an increase in microbial diversity actually is a good thing, that it leads to an improvement in health?
That's a good point. I think part of that is some correlation between hunter-gatherers, and I do like using hunter-gatherers as a marker of good health, but just because there's, some Hadza group or some group in South America eating 1,000 plants species per year, and they have this super amazing gut back microbiome supposedly, doesn't mean that everyone has to have that, because there's also hunter-gatherer groups that eat just meat and they have a great microbiome and they're great health.
Yeah, so this whole concept of diversity really baffles me. I do think that there's reasonable evidence that the overall phyla makeup, whether it's a Bacteroidetes or a Firmicutes, I think that is actually relatively scientifically based. But in terms of people saying you need to have X number of this number of species to be considered healthy, this is really not based on any science at all, and it's just a nice theory that somebody's come up with, and it seems to have appealed to the mind of the public, and it's been republished in the media ad nauseum, so much so that now people believe it. But again, it's junk science. It's correlation versus causation. We know just because some people might have a more diverse microbiome, them being healthier, doesn't prove that the microbiome caused it. And just remember, I can change your microbiome literally overnight by changing your diet. Within 24 hours apart, 2 samples will be massively, massively different. So your microbiome is a reflection of what you eat. Nothing more, nothing less.